Hi, everyone. Welcome to the November 8th edition of API Machinery. We have a short agenda, so maybe we can have some time back at the end. Stephen, do you want to talk about your item?
Yeah, so I think most of you have read it already. I sent the same thing to Cube devs this morning. There's a pending PR for quite some time, which are rebased again, which moves the core types, the internal core types, to package APIs core. So as all the other API groups, it's just a code level package move and a lot of fix-ups of the imports. There's no semantical change in API machinery or the group name. So it's really mostly syntactical. Yeah, and it's maybe green soon and will merge, so people have to adapt the imports, nothing else.
Yeah, okay. And just to be extra clear, this is not putting the internal types in a easy to import package. It leaves them in the main Kubernetes repository.
Yes.
So there's still debate on whether we want to encourage people to do that and to reference them. Yeah. Okay. Any questions, comments on that item? David, would you like to talk about, or would you like to demo your webhook admission?
I would. Would you mind giving me, I think you have to stop sharing so that I can share.
Yeah, okay. Stop sharing.
All right. And if things went well, you guys should be seeing a terminal right now.
Yep.
All right, so I'm going to show the current state of webhook admission as it is in master using an example server and a helper library that I built to show how the pieces work. So I've just started using hack local up cluster, and I am going to install an API server. It happens to be an API server that runs an admission webhook. And if you look at how it's deployed, you can see that I have a daemon set that's going to run it. I have a secret with my serving certificates, service account to grant permissions to, and then I have a stanza to register the API, and then one stanza to register the external webhook. I've got a little script that does the certificate glue for me. Creates a serving certificate with the right name and creates the secret for it and that sort of thing, just because that you can't reasonably put in a list. So we're going to take a look to see if our API server is up, and we can see from the status that it is now available. And so we will use kubectl get raw to be able to take a look at the discovery information, because it's taking advantage of the feature that we put in last release to enable polymorphic endpoints like scale. So you can see that we have a group version of admission online OpenShift.io, but we accept a kind for our namespace reservations type of admission review. And if you're familiar with webhook admission, that's the type that the server is going to send. Now, what we can actually do, because we have made this an API server, is we can actually use kubectl to send an example request for an admission review type and test our admission plugin. So you can see here, this is an admission review object. It's simulating the creation of a namespace. This is roughly what the actual Kube API server would send. And this makes painfully obvious some serialization bugs that exist, but they will be updated. I think Chow actually has an open poll for it now. So I'm going to take advantage of the kubectl create raw to send my data to a particular endpoint. And so I am sending that data to the API server I just created. And you can see that it's sending back a response saying, yes, I would allow this. One interesting thing to note about this is that it is actually protected by RBAC. So if I try that same call as the user deads, you end up forbidden by the API server. So it's not there for everyone to play with. It is protected like every other resource that we have. So this admission plugin is designed to look at a custom resource that we create, also called a namespace reservation, but in a different group. And it's going to look to see if I have a matching name. And if I have a matching name, it will prevent someone from creating that namespace. So I'm going to go ahead and create that custom resource object. And then I'm going to run the same simulated admission review again. And we can see this time, instead of getting back true, we get back a failure, and it gives us a message that says DEDS is reserved. So if we test it against the actual creating a namespace, we should get back this nice message. It says we have an admission webhook, tells us which one it is, and tells us why it prevented the request from succeeding. So that's interesting and that's valuable. Shows you how to integrate with the Kube API server. But another thing that actually works is working with an extension API server. So I happen to have one from a while back. I'm not sure how much you guys remember, but there was a project API that I showed. It was an ACL filtered view of namespaces. So there was an API that said, show me the namespaces that I'm allowed to see. So I am creating a namespace for it, and you can see it just doesn't, it actually does use that custom resource, doesn't just unconditionally fail. Got some RBAC resources for it, and then another list for installing. I think I showed it to you last time we did it, so I'm just going to go ahead and create that, and it's going to make the daemon set that runs my, my extension API server. And so if we take a look at the admission webhook configuration, you can see that we have it wired to create namespaces, but we also have it wired to create for creates on project requests. And a project request was an endpoint from this project's server. So just to refresh your memory about how this works, if you do a kubectl get project, as the cluster admin, you see all the namespaces, but if you were to do it as DEDS, DEDS isn't allowed to see any projects. And if you add him to, if you bind him to the view role inside of a particular project, and then request again, you can see now you get a result that says that there's this particular project there, which corresponds to a namespace. So there is a resource for this server that allows you to create a project request. And so I'm going to pipe that through sed. And create it as DEDS. We run afoul of RBAC. It never fails. So you can see here, I guess, make some lemonade. The request is actually coming from the API server running the project API server. The admission webhook knows this and knows that it does not have permission to actually make the request. So the aggregator blocked the request. So let's see, I probably have one. Yes, good, in history. And so I can create it, and let's try that request again. Okay, so I was able to create the project request, and now when you look, you can see I have another project. But if you recall, DEDS is reserved. So if we try to create the project DEDS, this is the sed giving us a project request for DEDS, we get an error telling us that it is reserved. And for the suspicious people, we can actually modify that bit of admission configuration to stop doing it for namespaces. And if we then try to run the same command again, we still get from the project request that it's not allowed to create a project request, but using the direct namespace create, because we've now removed that bit of the configuration, you're allowed to create the DEDS namespace directly. So the configuration that we have here shows that we have something that's easy to install, develop, deploy, test, and troubleshoot. And it's secure by default. And I can actually show you the amount of user-driven code that has to be written if you want to make one of these. It takes less than 150 lines and there's very little glue. You say where you want your resource to be, and then you spend the bulk of your code describing what your admission plugin actually does. And then there's a little bit of admission or initialization work to be able to get a client to make the requests.
So this is really nifty. My only reservation about this is that it creates an entry in the type system for each webhook. I think we need to figure out how to make the aggregator make an entry of each webhook should be an additional object in the system, not an additional type.
Each webhook should be an additional object in the system, not an additional.
Because you're basically the way you've wired it up, each webhook request has to go through the aggregator.
Oh, that's an easy way to set it up in a portable, secure way today. It keeps secrets from leaking out into other components. As SIG Auth completes more of its container identity work, and in particular, probably the trustworthy JOTs from Mike Denise, I think we'll be able to start wiring pieces directly as peers.
Yeah, so I just want to point out that this is probably not how we're going to recommend people set it up in production.
I think that for beta, this is a very reasonable way to start our setup here.
As far as it showing up in the type system, the concern is about the end user perceiving it, Daniel?
Well, it's also like Kubernetes, like we intend to have lots of objects in the system. I'm not sure that we intend to have lots of types in the system.
Because one thing, so Mike and I, like when we were playing around with the JOT stuff, the authorizer, like every bit of the authorizer problem was basically an aggregated API problem, including both the server-side code and all that. So I think some of this is like the logical categorization is different, but the practical categorization is almost exactly the same. I mean,
the other thing that I'm concerned about is taking 10 or 20 trips through the aggregator for each create or put request. That doesn't seem great.
So the hook is being run on the aggregated and it's going back out through the API server to another aggregator.
Yeah. And so that's a way, if you're concerned about not wanting to leak, say, a service account credential through,
Right.
This is a very easy way to actually configure things to get started. I think for beta, it's completely acceptable to do. I could even see people choosing to do it instead of trying to set up more complicated configurations. There are other things that are possible to do, certainly with the power we've given people for config. But from a practical, I want to see this get started. I want to prove that it works. I want to have something very easy for me to create and maintain. And I'm not worried about having an extra hop. The biggest problem with this is there's an extra hop. I'm not worried about having an extra hop for the type. Then this is actually a very good solution.
I will admit that it's pretty cool that RBAC works with it, but I think if we want to have a bunch of different API servers that recognize the same type, we should set them up as objects under like one group version kind, and let the aggregator understand an additional level.
And another, I mean, like this is kind of like we're backing into a microservices framework for discovery and mesh, and we've always kind of said that we need something like that. I mean, we probably don't want to take hard dependencies on something that doesn't fit well with Kube, but if it's not going to be Istio or something like that, like what are we going to do? Are we going to keep reinventing the wheel and just push it onto users, or? Yeah,
I mean, I think as you're setting up RBAC rules, like your rules should all be collected by type, right? You should see your webhook rules on a single type, not a dozen different types, or 2 dozen or 3 dozen. I think that's a lot more understandable. Let's see, what else was I going to say? Oh yeah. So and in addition to a bunch of other things that we're working on, Jenny's working on putting together an E2E test that exercises the auth stack. Yeah. We have other people out of the camera. So look for that in the next week or two. We split it up, and we have to plumb some qconfig files to API server, because that's where the token or certs are going to come from. So look for that in a few steps. Also on this, Chow has like half a dozen PRs that are in various states of progress that we'll try to be reviewing very quickly. And my API change is, I just started working on like actually wiring it through the system now that we figured out what we're doing. And Mehdi has a PR that'll be ready shortly that actually duplicates the API into validating, and well, it renames to validating and duplicates to mutating. So that's the rest of the status on webhooks. I think we've got enough time left to get everything done. The issue is there's going to be kind of a rebase freight train. So everybody who's got a PR that might be blocked by a rebase, like we may want to get together and use Git like it's intended, and like rebase on top of each other, so that there's less to do when we start getting these PRs in. So I guess if you've got a PR that needs to go in this sequence, maybe coordinate with me, I guess. Cool. Anything else?
I figured I would go ahead and mention that that there is a generic admission server project that I built that allows you to easily create an admission webhook server that is also an API server. It's just an easy starting point to do it, and I'll be keeping it up to date as we add more pieces like the mutation hooks.
Yeah. I've started an outline for a user guide, so that may show up in a PR or something at some point, because I think we have to document this really clearly because it is super confusing. Okay, let's see. Looks like Clayton added something.
Yeah. So we were kind of going through the state of the kube control split in SIG CLI earlier. After that, I had a couple of discussions with both Jordan and Jeff Regan, and we were kind of like the heart of the issue is breaking the dependency on internal types in kube control, because everything else is a fairly concrete change. Mm-hmm. Printers continue to be the thing that we depend heavily on, because printers are a huge touch point. They touch practically every part of the API, and we have a lot of APIs.
And like in theory, printers cannot be implemented in the client because the client doesn't understand all the possible things that could be aggregated.
Right, yeah, like they're just broken for aggregated types, and we do the best effort by guessing. So there was a discussion about what would be like the most impactful couple of changes that would drive us forward to replacing SIG or getting the kube control out. Breaking internal is the hardest of all of those, and of the internal, printers are the worst. So I briefly passed this by Brian and Jeff and Jordan, and we all kind of had at least somewhat of the same mindset, which would be when we release a new version of kube control, we have to keep -1 version compatibility. And to do that, we have to have a previous version on beta in order to do server-side Git. And so there was a discussion of, can we move server-side Git to beta on the API side in 1.9, and then get the client, like we're 80% on track to get the client-side version in alpha for 1.9. And then we would potentially be in a state in 1.10 to drop all printers from kube control, which would mean then that kube control could potentially cut its worst dependency on internal versions in 1.10.
So what is the current state of server-side Get? Because I haven't been following that carefully.
The API implementation has been there since 1.8. It is an alpha. It is a fully so I believe all the types are implemented. We don't have a reflective test. I'm pretty sure we're missing at least one. The implementations are all shared. The implementation is pretty much validated. The work, I think, on beta is The actual structure of the API is fairly generic, but we need to firm up some bits and get kind of push through on the bug side to be totally sure that we haven't screwed something up with like how we represent a simple value. I think the concern is structure and the meaning of fields, which is very beta-y. If we had to, we could the thought would be if kubectl 1.10 can talk to a 1.9 server that's beta and just works, then kubectl drops all that code because every version that kubectl supports has that version.
Mm-hmm.
I would like that to happen, but I do have reservations about trying to move the server side to beta without having had a kubectl, at least to my knowledge, without having a kubectl that uses it actively.
That's the thing is, we haven't done like that. That code is still mostly coming because of other refactors in kubectl to get up to spot. So at best,
I think we also want the garbage collector to use that code. So that's another possible.
Yeah, object meta was being proposed to move to beta. We didn't put it in the features list, but object meta there hasn't been any comment about. That has to be in beta for the garbage collector to use it. But I don't think the garbage collector changes were going to happen in 1.9. But I agree, David, with David's concern. I think it's valid. I'm trying to think of, we have to get kubectl out. If we don't do this in 1.9, kubectl is probably not coming out until 1.11.
I'm not saying that I don't want to do that. I think what I'm trying to say is that I think I feel better if in 1.9 you actually made it, and maybe even do that by default.
Well, we could do an experimental on kubectl. We could do it by default. If we were going to, there's no reason not to do it. If it's beta, there's no reason not to do it by default and fall back in 1.9.
Yeah, anyway, I'd like to see a pull that actually switches kubectl first. Yeah. Not removing all the printers, but actually making it so that, hey, I can get it like this as a printer.
Removing the printers could not come until 1.9 or 1.10 anyway. So the pull that was going to happen for 1.9 was alpha, an experimental flag.
Okay.
If we want to do this for 1.9, we need to make a decision about whether we're going to go through, get the release stuff updated now, and then the necessary supporting resources.
I don't object. I don't know that I or other people here have that much bandwidth to review it. Do you have people to work on it?
So I am currently in the critical path for the implementation, so I will need a reviewer.
Okay. And it's probably best if we have a reviewer over here so that everybody understands it.
Yeah.
Okay. How large of a change is this going to end up being?
It's most of the supporting work is there. Basically, get.go has accumulated large amounts of cruft. I've been trying to refactor that over the course of this release. The actual change is going to be when we ask the server through the generic helper, we're going to pass a different MIME type, and we're going to get back a runtime object, and we're going to check to see whether it's a table.
Right.
And if it's a table, we're going to pass it into the printer, and the printer already has the support to deal with tables.
I think the summary of that is mostly SIG CLI, so someone like Phil, right?
Who just had a baby and is out.
Yeah, who goes out for, I don't know. I didn't expect to see him until next year.
Yeah, Fabiano's currently bandwidth limited. The people who know get.go is fairly limited.
Adohi? I don't know his actual name.
Yeah, Tony,
yeah.
Once upon a time, I wrote the printers, but I don't know if I know them at this point.
You shouldn't take credit for those.
Yeah, there's no changes to the printers left. That was all done in 1.8 and 1.9. Okay. So it is the mechanism whereby we pass in, it's kind of the get.go is just ugly, and it's got to get simplified a little bit. That's where the hard part's going to be, is not breaking any of the 8,000 layered things we've done in there.
So Clayton, why don't you just bug me over Slack when you think you're ready, and I will find somebody to do it.
I'm going to add a note to the release ticket for server-side Git and say we are considering moving this into 1.9, and I'll add you and Brian, and we'll say we're still evaluating, but we'd like approval and agreement.
I think Anthony is the release
Yes.
releaser, so we probably want to tag him also.
Yep.
Okay.
Thanks for pushing on that. That is thankless work, initially at least.
Yeah.
But it seems like it's sticking everything together. So.
Yeah, that'd be pretty awesome. I'd love for the garbage collector to be able to.
Yeah. And Dan has been working on that. Dan Mace has been working on that. I don't know that he'll get to it for 1.9, but that would be something that we would prioritize.
Yeah, I appreciate the quick fix from Dan on the thing yesterday. For posterity, the garbage collector caused a boot loop and controller manager. So when discovery failed, so that's not good. Since we're on the topic of the garbage collector, I have seen multiple people who really could use access to the graph that the garbage collector tracks. So I think in a future release, we probably want to actually add an API to the garbage collector that lets people query the ownership graph.
I think I would build that in the other direction. So I agree that a lot of people are interested in the graph and that it's really useful to have.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that I would try to approach it from I want to make use of a pre-existing graphing library of some kind, and then I want the garbage controller to make use of that.
Sorry, I don't mean like a visual graph. I mean like exposing who's the owner, who's the tree of parents of this object.
Yeah, they have graph libraries to do that.
But the garbage collector already has this graph. So
well, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is that I would actually build that graph separately, use something built on top of our API to use some sort of standard library that builds the graph, and then change the garbage controller, the garbage collection controller, to make use of that graph API.
So I can see like taking the thing that we've already got, making that into an API and changing the garbage collector logic to be requests on that API. But seeing as we already have a thing that does what we want, I'm not sure of the wisdom of rewriting it.
I was actually working on drafting a proposal for this. This is Cole Mickens. And the first pass I was going to take it was simply proposing the API that we want to offer up to expose this graph. And then possibly having a proof of concept where we just reuse the garbage collection logic, and then evaluating, potentially using etcd even to do initialization of fields to build out the graph at object storage time in etcd.
Are you guys thinking a more generalized graph or a more specific graph for ownership?
I don't necessarily know the difference between those two descriptors in this context.
Yeah,
More generalized would be
That
cool.
is something that works
I-
with
I'm a little scared about adding preconditions in etcd because right now all of our objects are logically separate, and there may not be in fact there certainly won't be an etcd instance which can keep you can't do the reference checking at creation time because you might need to update two or more different etcd instances.
No, I guess what I'm saying is that you have like GraphQL already exists, right? I would.
I wouldn't. I don't want to invent our own graph query language. Definitely not.
So yeah, but when I think about a graph, right? When I think about trying to query a graph, that's the sort of thing that I think of.
I see. That's what you're. That's what.
And so if I were going to create a graph, that would be a really useful thing to have, something really useful to expose.
I wasn't thinking nearly that advanced. I was thinking literally, give me the tree of parents of this object.
Yeah, that was my question. David and I are asking because David and I have done 3 or 4 different iterations on building out full graph relationships between all the objects in a cube system, and we keep kind of bouncing off the how specific do we want to be, but there's a lot of operational challenges that you just can't represent without getting access to something like a fairly generic graph, and so that's.
Yeah, so clearly there's a lot of discussion that needs to happen on this. I just thought it might be worth mentioning as something that's probably.
Cole, you're gonna pull the proposal on that up?
Yeah, I'm drafting a doc right now. I'm hoping to get it sent out at least by this time next week. So hopefully people can take a look, and then in 2 weeks we can chat about it more.
Yeah.
Okay. David and I can add some of where we're coming from on this.
That would be very much appreciated.
Yep. Okay. I think that's it for today, unless somebody else has something to talk about. Going once, going twice. All right. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you again in 2 weeks. Hopefully, everything about dynamic webhooks will be merged by then. All right. Bye.